You are listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Well, happy Halloween, folks! Ha! I decided to finally shave my head and put a little color in my goatee and mustache. Do you like? Ha ha ha! Anyway, happy Thursday, happy Halloween. Yes, it's that day, finally. The day that my kids live for almost as much as Christmas because they get candy. And of course, if you're like me, you impose a daddy tax on any candy that comes through the door, meaning we get to pick while we check for safety of the candy and pull out all the nice Snickers bars and things like that. So welcome to my show. This is Scotty Roberts, and those of you listening audibly, I've got a mask on, so my voice is a little... Let me take it off now that yeah. There we go. That's like the old Mission Impossible episodes. You remember those? I think they did that in the movies as well. But you remember the old ones? Did you ever watch that from the 60s? The old Mission Impossible, and they had these immaculate masks that they'd wear and to fool the bad guys. And then, of course, at the reveal, when they've won their mission, they peel off the face. And, of course, it was the actor playing the bad guy doing it, but then they'd peel off the face and reveal. So there you are. There's me, Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. If you want to come and listen to the audio-only version, that's the one that broadcasts out to all the internet networks and the terrestrial radio stations and so on, nationally, and might I add, internationally broadcast. And you can join the visual in the video simulcast of this show over on my YouTube channel, Mr. Scotty Roberts. And join the chat room. We've got a lively bunch in there tonight. So join us. You can chat about the show live and about whatever else you want, as long as you stay on topic as much as you can. So welcome. Again, happy Halloween. I love this time of year because I love autumn and I love fall. And I wanted to do a show on Halloween and the history of Halloween, but this has been done ad infinitum many times over. I remember 10 years ago when we were publishing Intrepid magazine. Also, I think for Taps Paramagazine, when I worked with them, the Ghost Hunters official magazine. We had a good friend of mine, Nancy Planetta, write an article on the history of Samhain or Halloween. Because we have all of our holidays that we have appropriated from paganism, from Halloween to Christmas and Easter and other times of the year, there is always a more ancient story behind it. And so rather than go into just a strict regurgitation of the history of Halloween, I wanted to give you some ideas of stuff that was going on kind of around it. Let's go a little deeper, superficially deeper, but deeper nonetheless. And there is a let's see if I can get my notes here. I want to start with just talking about I wanted to talk a little bit about witches. I wanted to talk about the pagan festivals, the pagan wheel of the year, things like that. Why don't we start out with the whole pagan festival and the wheel of the year, and we can get a little idea of what's going on here at Halloween time, or Samhain. And the pagan wheel of the year, there are elaborate rituals and events that mark this sacred cycle of the year. And as more and more people, it seems, in our society are drifting away from traditional Christianity, traditional Judaism, traditional religion, we see more and more people that are describing themselves as spiritual rather than religious. And experts expect this eco-friendly pagan movement that's going to continue to grow. Now, already there are perhaps 1 million pagans in the United States, if not more. And there's an equal number in Canada, and twice as many in Europe. You go to some places in Europe, for instance, and I'm not going to show it here, it just popped into my head, but when they were celebrating the opening of CERN, at CERN, the opening of the official building there, you know, the atom crusher over at CERN in Switzerland, they had a huge outdoor pagan festival. Go look this thing up. If I can during the break, I'll find a link for that and show you. You watch that festival, and it is filled with pagan spectacle. And you thought, what does any of this have to do with this scientific institution, installation? And it's almost mind-bending. But that's over in Europe, and that's how close they are to some of the pagan roots of things. And it might be a long time, if ever, before pagans really reclaim their Yule from Christmas or their Samhain from Halloween. And Samhain, by the way, you've seen the word probably. It's spelt funny. It's Samhain, pronounced Samhain, from Halloween. And it's nonetheless a really worthwhile endeavor to explore and to study these ancient religious traditions. And the Wheel of the Year follows a pagan cycle of festivals. Let me show you that. I've got that pagan cycle here, and we'll call it up here right now so you can take a look. Those of you listening, of course, you're not going to be able to see this, so I'll describe it. It's a pagan festival and wheel of events, so to speak, and it's divided into different times of the year. And take a look at that for a second. You see Samhain is at the top at the 12 o'clock position. And then it goes from there into, we have Yule, which is the winter solstice. We have Imbolc, or Candlemas, which is kind of at the 3 o'clock position. Then Ostara. And then I've got a cut off on my thing here. I'm sorry about that. On the visual I've got up, it cuts off the bottom a little bit, but Beltaine is at the bottom, and that's the opposite time of the year from Halloween. Then you got Midsummer, or Litha, and then after that is Lughazad, or Lammas, and then Mabon in the autumn for the autumn equinox, and then back to Samhain. And so this is the calendar, and we're going to take a look at some of these and examine some of this as it pertains to what we've got right now, which is Samhain and Halloween, which we've made into Halloween. And I'm not going to get really deep into exploring this, but to give you kind of a primer on what this is all about. So the Latin word pagan, first let's start talking about paganism a little bit. Now, I am not a pagan. There was one point where I identified myself as a Christian pagan. And I don't want you to think because I do a lot of talk about paganism that I'm just a full-bore pagan. I'm really not in the traditional sense, but I love the history of it. And the Latin word means non-participant, one who's excluded from a more distinguished or professional group. And that's kind of a broad meaning of the word pagan. It meant country folk. It came in vogue during the 4th century. So you're talking in the 300s. This is when Constantine was coalescing the Roman Empire as a Christian empire. He was using that as the model. Remember, he said one emperor equals one god, one empire equals one religion. And so during that same time, Christianity was gaining legitimacy in the pagan countries. And the word's often used pejoratively, and it implies that there's some sort of inferiority. They were referred to as the country folk, these pagans, as the non-sophisticated. You could almost say it's a simile to what we used when we called in the United States, as we expanded west, the Native Americans were savages. So it's that kind of thinking. And the word's often used that way. It's a pejorative. And now today, we don't know a whole lot about the historical paganism because the ancient medieval scholars rarely thought the customs fit to be written down. These were not recorded in written history. But in modern times, paganism is still the catch-all term for believers outside of the major religious faiths. Paganism or heathen, we've heard that as well. Maybe that's more appropriate to use it as a simile for savage, which is what we call the Native American peoples here in this country. But it's also qualified, the word pagan, as modern paganism, contemporary paganism, or neo-paganism. It describes groups that claim to be derived from an ancient pagan belief, and it includes such religious movements as Wicca, which is basically your word from witchcraft comes from that. Neo-Druidism and the goddess movements. These are all things that come from paganism. Now, note that paganism's use, it's used to describe Western belief systems as opposed to African or Asian or indigenous traditions. You don't find ancient African religions referred to as paganism. So it's more in the West that this was used, and they share characteristics such as being nature-focused, being polytheistic, many gods, honoring the female divine principle, as opposed to the male divine principle of Abrahamic religions like Christianity, Judaism, Islam. And exact figures of modern pagans are really hard to come by, as there's still such a negative stigma attached to such beliefs. And some fear being persecuted for believing this. And I want to say really, too, that even in the church, as we've discussed in other shows, that paganism has seeped into the practice in Christianity. You look at especially the Roman Catholic Church, with all the liturgy, with all the symbolism, with all the paganistic pomp and circumstance that goes into the ritual. These are all things that were birthed out of paganism, adapting paganism to Christianity. You don't see as much of it in Judaism. They had their own, because remember, Judaism was Middle Eastern, so that all rose out of a very different sort of paganism, even though you wouldn't classify it as paganism. So the pagan cosmology, their calendar, their way of dating the world is cyclical. And much like Eastern religions, all things are in a perpetual cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. As a matter of fact, if I had my tarot cards sitting here, and I don't think I do, I think they're over in my attaché. The Wheel of Fortune is one of the cards from the Major Arcana, and it shows that life is cyclical, is the meaning of that. What you might lose on the downturn, you gain on the upswing. That life is all this circular, cyclical events, birth, death, rebirth, all of those sorts of things. You can find that in the born-againism of some evangelical Christianity. The birth, the death, the rebirth, and the resurrection, in baptism, in being born again, the rebirth, and so on. And so paganism ties this whole cycle to the seasons, the annual progression, as well as the waxing and the waning strength of the sun. Pagan holidays are aligned with the days that mark key points in the annual cycle, notably the beginning and the peak of the 4 seasons. And there are 8 widely celebrated holidays throughout the pagan traditions. Each is usually celebrated with a community festival and seasonally appropriate rituals. And these festivals can be depicted visually with the Wheel of the Year symbol, which I threw up a little earlier. And sorry again to those of you listening on the radio, you weren't able to see that, but you can come back anytime over to the YouTube channel at Mr. Scotty Roberts. Call up this episode and you can see that, or you can join us over here while you listen, and you'll be able to see this again. I'll put it up in a second here. And the eightfold wheel, it's a modern innovation, and it looks like an 8-armed sun cross. And each segment of the wheel of the year represents about 6 or 7 weeks. Let me throw this up here again so you can see what I'm talking about. We put it up a little earlier, but here it is again. And sorry, in my graphic here, I accidentally cut off the bottom. That's Samhain that you're, I'm sorry, not Samhain, Beltaine that you're missing at the bottom. Spring festival. But each segment of the wheel of the year represents about 6 or 7 weeks as you're viewing it here. 4 points are based on the solar calendar, the winter and summer solstice, and the spring and autumn equinox. And the other 4 points are based on Celtic festivals and are often called by their Celtic names: Imbolc, Beltaine, Lugnasta, and Samhain. And note that all 8 holidays go by a wide variety of names, depending on where you are and what tradition you were considering, what language you spoke sometimes. And so the 12 o'clock on the pagan wheel of the year is the winter solstice. That's Yule. And the Norsemen of the northern Europe saw the sun as a wheel that changed the seasons. And so we're not there yet. And on this particular diagram, sorry, I've got the 12 o'clock. It's actually pointing to about 2 o'clock. And so let me pull this down, and let's just get into continue talking about this. So the Norsemen saw the sun as a wheel that changed the seasons. It was from the word for this wheel, hul, that the whole word Yule is thought to have come. And we're talking like 2000 BC and way back. And so like many other ancient peoples, the Norse celebrated this day with bonfires, with storytelling, and with feasting. And by the Norse, I mean, you're basically your Viking, your Scandinavians. And for the Romans, this was the peak of the week-long Saturnalia festival, where houses were decorated with greenery, candles were lit, and presents were exchanged. This is where you get your Christmas wreaths, your Christmas trees, the greenery, the evergreen, and the candles being lit and presents being exchanged. And the Celtic Druids burned a Yule log. You should try that sometime. We've only done that once in my life, where we burned a Yule log, and you sit up all night and watch the log burn off. And during this time, it was in order to banish the darkness and any evil spirits that may accompany it. And in all cases, the day marks the death of the sun, the rebirth of the sun. And it was celebrated more domestically than the summer solstice. Next on the pagan wheel, you have Imbolc, which is Disibult or Brigid's Day, Bridget's Day, and the Candlemas. And Imbolc comes at the first signs of spring. And at this time, the supply of food from the previous harvest is running pretty low. The holiday is of great importance for not only a successful new farming season, but also to ensure that the earth supplies enough food for people to make it until the next harvest. It's said that like many Celtic festivals, the Imbolc celebrations centered around the lighting of fires. Fire was perhaps more important for this festival than others, as it was also the holy day of Brigid or Brigid. It's also known as bride, as Brigit, as Brid, Bridget, the goddess of fire, of healing, of fertility. And the lighting of the fires really celebrated the increasing power of the sun over the coming months. And this is also dates way back to 2000 BC. And now the next spot on the wheel is the vernal equinox, or Ostara. And the vernal equinox celebrates the renewal of life on earth, the coming of spring. It's a time of rejuvenation and childlike wonder at the glories of the earth. And the day coincides with festivals for Aphrodite, Hathor of Egypt, Ostara, and Easter. Ostara, Easter, you see the similarities in the words. And there could also be some some fun lasciviousness handled in a ceremonial, ritual-type way at these festivals and these fires. Now, the next festival is, of course, Beltaine. This is in May, or May Eve, what we've now watered down to May Day. And it's Rudmas, it's Shendu Boalin, and the Celtic May Day. And so the Celtic Beltaine means the fires of Bel. Now, if you recall from a lot of our other studies, Bel, the same as Baal or Baal. You remember in Old Testament times, the prophets were always warning Israel to get rid of the worshippers of Baal and Asherah, the goddess, and to tear down the groves of Baal, and to tear down they were really like phallic symbols, the tall standing stones and the Baal images. So it means fires of Baal is what Beltaine means, and to the ancient Celtic deity of Baal, or Bel. And this, you notice, I think that's very interesting, that all through recorded history we seem to have these same gods that are represented in different religions, different cultures, and different forms. So the spring, if by the way, if you were in church and you grew up and you learned in Sunday school the pagan worship of Baal in Israel, ancient Israel, because that's what you'd learn in church, this is the same God that we're talking about here when we get to Bel and the Beltaine fires. And the Spring Fire Festival is meant to celebrate the coming of summer, as well as the fertility of the plants and the animals, or the coming year. And more than any other pagan holiday, fire plays a key role in the Beltaine, as it's believed to cleanse and revitalize, the cleansing of fire. You ever notice when lightning strikes a forest, and there is a forest fire that occurs naturally, it cleanses out the undergrowth. It may look devastating, but it cleanses and it fertilizes the ground. So cattle are paraded between the bonfires to ensure strength and fertility for the herd. For similar reasons, some people opt to jump over the flame to increase fertility, jumping the Beltaine fire. Strip down naked and jump the Beltaine fire. As a matter of fact, I had written in or about my character, Tam O'Hare, in the small kids novel that I wrote, young adults novel, illustrated about, and I used it's anthropomorphized, all animals, but Tam O'Hare was very Christian. And a couple of times in the book, he crosses himself in what I called in the book Christian incantation. But he would also be the kind of person who would believe very strongly in the Roman Catholic faith, but at the same time would strip naked and jump the Beltaine fires in the summer. And so much of Beltaine's rituals revolve around the needs of farming communities who are looking forward to a fruitful year ahead. And it's also a time when many marriages took place or were arranged at Beltaine. There was a time when there was a lot of sexuality that took place as well. And this was for ritual purposes, although I'm sure people may have even pagans may have used that for a fun time to get a little action on the side. Pardon me, pagans who are listening. It was considered a fun festival, fertility festival. Everything about fertility was to bring fertility to the farming, to their communities, to their livestock, to everything. And it included humans as well. So moving on, down the pagan wheel, you've got the summer solstice, or Midsummer's Eve, the gathering day, Litha, Alban Hefin, Fili Shelthai, if I'm pronouncing that right, Sheltai. And similar to the winter solstice, this holiday is about celebrating the awesome power of the sun. But whereas Yule is about missing the sun and the waning sun and the coming of the frosty months ahead, and wishing it would come back, Litha is about honoring the sun while it's at its peak of its glory. Going again, thinking of this in my tarot deck, there is the card in the major arcana called the Sun. And that represents, the sun represented fertility, love, life, broad horizons and vision. And bonfires and feasting were common ways to celebrate this festival, and it was much more public and communally celebrated than its winter counterpart. And on this day, the Chinese celebrated Li, the goddess of light, and the Christians celebrated the feast of John the Baptist. And at that, where I just noticed on the clock, we're at the end of the first segment, and I got a boogie, or we're going to run overtime. So sit tight for 2 minutes. We'll be right back. Welcome back, folks. Thanks for sitting through the break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're watching the Intrepid radio program or listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on Odyssey Radio Network, ODYSY1.com, Odyssey1.com for the audio, and you can join us over on the simulcast in video over on my YouTube channel, Mr. Scotty Roberts. Jump into As If You're Naked and Jumping the Beltaine Fires into the chat room and join all the other Intrepids that are there. Now, we ended last, and I'm going to just jump right back into it with no fanfare. We were talking about the summer solstice, and we're going to move now into the next point on the wheel, and since we're in the second segment, let me throw this image up again. Now, we had Beltaine, which we just talked about, is way down at the bottom, but I accidentally cut that off. I apologize for that. Then we have the Midsummer Festival, which comes next. And this is Lugnasad, or Lamas, and Frey Feast. And the festival traditionally marks the first day of the harvest. Oh, wait, I jumped. I am over on that's the fall festival. The summer solstice is where you have celebrating the awesome power of the sun. And that's what we just went through. Pardon my getting a little mixed up in my own notes here. But on the pagan wheel next is Lugnasad and the Lamas, the Frey Feast. This feast festival traditionally marks the first day of the harvest. It commemorates the death of Lugh, the Celtic god of light, the son of the sun. Lugh is the medium through which the power of the sun can enter the grain and ripen it. So we're at the end of summer now, and we're entering the harvest time with this festival. And in the mythological story of the Wheel of the Year, the sun god transfers his power into the grain, and it's sacrificed when the grain is harvested. So we have a dying, self-sacrificing, resurrecting God of the harvest who dies for his people so that they may live. And the harvest continues until Samhain. And if you remember back when we were talking about all the pagan godmen, the Gnostic mysticism, this was that whole death and resurrection time. Now, the next on the wheel is the autumnal equinox, Mabon, and the harvest tide. And this is the festival for the harvest season. And it's a time for reflecting on the past summer, preparation for the coming winter. This is almost like a Thanksgiving time, where you're gathering the goods, you're reflecting on the harvest, you're eating plenty, you're feasting, you're putting up stores for the winter. And it's a time when the waning power of the sun is obvious. And however, it's still important to give thanks for the food obtained in the harvest, or else the next year might not be so abundant. Now you start to look at all of these things and you say, well, there's obviously superstition put into this. Yes, but there was a supernatural, a spiritual belief that the gods controlled all these things at certain times of the year. Go next to the final position on the wheel, Samhain, or Winter Nights, Halloween, Hallows, Hallowtide, Shadowfest, Ellentide, Third Harvest, Harvest Home, Gimrid, Day of the Dead, Spirit Night, Candle Night, November Eve, Nutcrack Night, Ancestor Night, and Apple Fest, and of course, Halloween. This festival marks the end of the harvest, and thus the end of the summer, the beginning of the winter. It's also the festival for the dead. This is the day that's supposed to be the point of time when the veil that separates the world of mortals and the world of the spirits is at its thinnest, enabling the souls of the dead, witches, fairies, elementals, and all sorts to mingle with living people. Now you can start to see by that where we started to get our modern, more commercial Halloween out of that. But this doesn't necessarily mean it's a scary, spooky, frightful time or a mournful time. Loved ones who've died are invited to join in the end of the festival feasts, the harvest feasts, and they're asked to watch over the newest members of the community. So this time of the year, which Catholics went and called All Saints' Night, All Hallows' Eve, which was last night, the night before Halloween, and then Halloween, the time when all the spirits mingle with the living. This is a time of the ancestors, a time where everything was to be brought together, a time when there was a worship of the ancestors, where demonic-looking masks were used to ward off the evil, and there were gifts of apples and things like that were left for children. And these were feasts they were asked to watch over the newest members of the community. And Samhain is the time when all those born during the past year are officially welcomed into the community. This was like a welcoming ceremony. And some pagans believe that this day is the optimal time for magic in particular. The Druids believed that this was the thinnest of the veil, that this thinnest time in the veil between worlds could allow them to see into the future. And that's what we have with the pagan calendar and how it led up to Halloween. And I think that this is something that we see played out in this whole idea of the ancestors. While it started with Samhain, you see it even, I had mentioned this in one show somewhere way back. When I was working out in Utah last year, we went to a buddy of mine and I who was working out there with me. We attended one of the Latter-day Saints, the Mormon churches. And there were churches like every square mile for the communities in particular. And if you were in that community, you went to that gathering. And we attended there, and there was just to show that we were not just selling services to the community, but we were also going to try to be part of the community. And so it was an interesting exploration for me. And I found it interesting, one particular Sunday they were talking about the ancestors. And I did not realize how much Mormonism played on the ancestors. and how you would go and become part of the ancestors to the temple. And I don't have this all down pat as far as ritual, but I know I heard some people that were testifying at the front of the church in the communal gathering and talking with tears how they had brought somebody who had left the faith back in and were able to bring them to the temple and to reconnect them with their ancestors. I think this whole study of the ancestors and spirituality is much broader than we think. So in Mormonism, what we generally consider to be a branch of Christianity in a way, also had this worship of the ancestors. And so Halloween time, I think it's interesting. I think it would be interesting. I'd like to do it with my own kids. Now that I'm talking about this, why don't we take one Halloween and have them dress up as some of our ancestors for their costumes? I think that'd be great. I'd love it. As you know, I've got Son of a Patriot, which is my site where I sell all my shirts and my stuff that we make and all of that over on Etsy. You can go to etsy.com/sonofapatriot/shop Son of a Patriot. There, I slipped that in there, not knowing I was going to do that. But I've got my Revolutionary War era ancestors from here in America. And it'd be kind of neat to dress up my son as one of my ancestors with the tricorn hat and the blue coat of the revolutionaries of the colonial army and carrying his musket around. Probably have to be a toy musket. But things like that. Couldn't we go further back into Wales and Welsh history and pagan history? I think that'd be awfully interesting. Why don't you try that with your family sometime? Honor the... we take Thanksgiving time and we sit around the table, and most families that I know of at least offer a prayer at the beginning of Thanksgiving dinner. And it's usually, if you're not all that spiritually immersed in it, the prayer could be, thank you, God, for the food and for the great time, and we thank you for our lives. If you're a Christian, that tends to be a traditional practice, even if it's very watered down. Why don't we take Halloween time and take a moment to teach our kids? This is the time when, in its origination, when we honor the ancestors, and it's a time of year when the veil is the thinnest, and perhaps the spirits of our ancestors can cross over and mingle with us and offer us protection. Not scary ghosts, but the protection of our ancestors. Tell them about that tradition and see what they think. Talk about it the way I used to like to read at Christmas time. I used to like to read the Christmas story. If you're as old as I am and you remember the Peanuts, Charlie Brown Christmas special, and they had the little weak tree that would fall over, and Charlie Brown was very disillusioned at the time, and Linus came, he says, this is what Christmas is all about, and he cited the passage from Luke, the Gospel of Luke, and lo, the angel of the Lord appeared, and the heavens were filled with the heavenly host, and so on. Maybe we take times like that are traditional for Christmas and Thanksgiving. Why not make a tradition out of it at Halloween? And say, it's not just a time to dress up and go get candy, although that is what it has become in our culture. Why not take it from the superficial and lend it a little bit of meaning? That this is the time of the ancestors, the time when the veil is the thinnest. I think that'd be very interesting. Now, there's something else I wanted to cover, and I've only got a few minutes left to do this. Well, we got about 15 minutes left, and I think that's ample time to hit on this. Halloween time, and talking about how we dress our kids and things like that. You see an awful lot over the years. One of the most traditional female costumes has been the witch, dressed in black robes, the black pointy hat. Sometimes you paint the face green and put on a fake nose with a wart. And this has become our traditional commercial pop cultural vision of what a witch was. But there's really an evolution of the medieval witch and why she was usually depicted as a woman. Think of it this way, flying through the skies on a broomstick. The popular image of a witch is as a predominantly female figure, and more so at Halloween when we have dress-up time. It's an outfit for women and girls, and not usually, you don't see many boys dressed up as witches in the traditional Wizard of Oz sense of the Wicked Witch of the West. But where did this gendered stereotype come from? You know, you can say a guy nowadays in paganism, as neo-paganism is rising, guys can be witches too. We sometimes refer to them as warlocks. And it's so connected to Satanism and all those things in the commercial mind that we miss the meaning of these things. But why did it always seem that witches were women? At least in our cultural understanding of them. And by the way, when it comes to witches flying on broomsticks, they weren't always hags either. Again, if you're as old as I am, you remember the old series Bewitched with Elizabeth Montgomery. Hubba hubba. I've got to say, Elizabeth Montgomery, the hottest blonde witch I've ever seen. And they had that little cartoon animation at the beginning of the show, for the opening of the show, with her flying on a broomstick. So we've got that image in our mind, and that didn't help any reaffirming that image in our mind. But she took the ugliness out of the commercial side of being a witch. So part of the answer to this comes from medieval attitudes towards magic and the particular behaviors attributed to men and women within the crime of witchcraft. Yes, crime. Witchcraft was a crime. And it was all based, by the way, on church teachings. Taking one aspect of the witch's characterization in popular culture, her association with flight, you can see a transformation in attitudes between the early and the later Middle Ages. In the 11th century is when this took place. It was Bishop Burchard's of Worms, that was the town he was from, of Worms, said of certain sinful beliefs of witches. He said, "Some wicked women, turning back to Satan and seduced by the illusions and phantasms of demons, believe in the right night hours they ride on certain animals with the pagan goddess Diana, and a countless multitude of women, and they cross a great span of the world in the stillness of the dead of night." This was the Bishop Burchard of Worms said that in the 1100s. Now, according to Burchard, these women were actually asleep, but were held captive by the devil, who deceived their minds in dreams. And he also believed that none but the very stupid and dim-witted could think that these flights had actually taken place. But by the end of the 15th century, a few hundred years later, views of magic had changed considerably. While many believed about women flying through the skies persisted, the perception of these women had transformed from one of the skepticism to one of fear. The magic night became associated with secret gatherings of witches known as the Sabbath, involving nefarious acts such as killing babies, taking part in orgies, and worshiping the devil. I've never gotten the connection between orgies and killing of babies or worshiping the devil. Now, don't get me wrong. Think of that in different terms. I'm not going to go out on that branch. Let's just leave it where what I said. So this suggests that what was originally considered to be a belief held by only women and foolish men was now in the 1500s starting to be taken much more seriously. So what happened to cause this transformation? There is historian Michael D. Bailey kind of offers up a good explanation. It's that at some point during the 14th and 15th centuries, we're talking the 1300s to the 1400s, religious officials, maybe even unwittingly, conflated two distinct traditions: learned magic and common magic. There is a difference. If you want to read a good novel, I don't remember the author off the top of my head. It's a big novel. They actually did a mini-series on it on HBO, I think. Dr. Norrell, Dr. Strange and Mr. Norrell, I think is the title. And it's talking about in Victorian times, the use of magic verses, and this would be intellectual learned magic as opposed to common magic. There's a term that my friend Travis Thorpe, who is a pagan high priest, will tell you it's for magic misappropriations, for people doing stupid things with magic, thinking they can do stupid things with magic. They're all hoity-toity, pagan, I'm pagan, and I worship Satan, and I do black magic. And he calls it a magic malpractice of some sort. And I can't remember the words he used. Maybe Audrey remembers what he said, or even Rocky if you're in there. So the common kind of magic required no formal training. It was widely known. It could be practiced by men and women, and it was usually associated with love, sex, and healing. The most common spells asked for were love spells, sex spells, and of course healing. And by contrast, learned magic came to Europe from the East and featured in the magic manuals that circulated amongst the educated men whom Richard Kisthyfer described as members of clerical underworld. And interestingly, the descriptions of humans in flight do appear in these manuals, but in relation to men rather than women. And one example is found in a 15th century notebook in which the male author describes riding through the skies on a magically conjured demon horse, and so which coincided with the older traditions of Bishop Burchard and of Worms, who talked about women who were carried off in their sleep by Satan on various animals and things. Now, two key differences between this account and the ones associated with women are the person flying is an educated male, and demons are now explicitly involved in the act. And by conflating popular beliefs about the night flights of women with the demon conjuring magic of the clerical underworld, medieval inquisitors began to fear that women would fall prey to the corruption of demons they could not control. They didn't worry as much about the men, but women, our poor women will fall under control. So witchcraft in women started to come into vogue at this time. And while men also feature in the infamous 15th century witch hunting manual, the Malleus Maleficarum, which I've made reference to many times, sometimes when Rocky and I are talking about this stuff, the Malleus Maleficarum is the hammer of the witches, is what that basically means. The work has long been recognized as deeply misogynistic. And if you look into this stuff, it was written by a couple of guys whose names escape me at the moment, unless I can... Wait, I've got the cover of it here, which I can't show you. Thomas Primus. Let's see. I'm looking at the Old English. I can't make it out right now. But it was really written in a very misogynistic tone. It suggests that women perceived lack of intelligence, that a woman's perceived lack of intelligence made them submissive to demons. And one section reads this. This is from the Malleus Maleficarum. Just as though the first defect in their women's intelligence, they are more prone to abjure the faith, so through the second defect of inordinate passions, they inflict various vengeances through witchcraft. Wherefore it is no wonder that so great a number of witches exist in this sex, meaning women. So women were viewed as not being intelligent. And because they were not intelligent enough, they were more prone to demons who would lead them astray. And so by the end of the Middle Ages, a view of women as especially susceptible to witchcraft had emerged. And this notion that a witch might travel by broomstick, especially when contrasted with the male, who conjures up a great demon horse on which to rise, the woman gets a broomstick, underscores the domestic sphere to which women belonged at that time. Women took care of the house. They swept your floors as one of their things. And so they'd ride on broomsticks. Why demon animals? That's for men who have intelligence. And so the Malleus Maleficarum, it was really a witch hunter's handbook. And go look it up online. Malleus Maleficarum. It's Latin. You'll find it. It's very interesting reading. Now, this perceived threat to established norms, inherent in the idea that women were moving beyond their expected societal roles, is also mirrored in a number of accusations leveled against male witches. And by the way, I think that some women could have been drawn to witchcraft just to break free of that role that was imposed upon them of being domestics and non-intelligent. Could you imagine the draw of witchcraft when it told a woman, you are as intellectual as a male, sometimes more so? Now, in one example, a 13th century letter by Pope Gregory IX described a gathering of heretics, which was very similar to the later descriptions of the witches' Sabbath. It stated that at orgies, if there were not enough women, men would engage in depravity with other men. In doing so, they were seen to become effeminate, subverting the natural laws believed to govern sexuality. So magic then, in many ways, was viewed by the church as an expression of rebellion against established norms and institutions, including gender identity. And so being homosexual, being gay in modern terminology, was something that was a product of not having enough women at orgies of the Black Sabbath of witchcraft. And so you can see how the church took all of these pagan things and it really adulterated it, twisted it, and used it to define it the way they needed to define it. And many times you see the politics in this. It was because women were breaking free of the roles that men established upon them and the church established upon them. And that was a problem for the church. So the idea that women might have been dabbling with the demonic magics previously associated with educated males, however inaccurate that may be, was frightening. And neither men nor women were allowed to engage with demons. But while men stood a chance of resisting demonic control because of their education and intelligence, women were just a lost cause because they did not have education or intelligence. And we're drawn to the end of this their show, and so I want to finish this off. Their perception or their perceived lack of intelligence of women, together with contemporary notions regarding their passions, meant that they were understood as more likely to make pacts of fidelity to devils, whom they could not control. So in the eyes of the medieval church, women were more easily disposed to witchcraft than men were. And that's an interesting study, and there's so much more to it, but we're so out of time. Maybe we'll pick this up. I've still got to pick up what we were talking about last night, because I left us at a breaking point on this whole thing of body language and so on. But I want to pick this up too. So tomorrow night, let's see which way we go. Got a 23-hour break coming on us right now. You guys sit tight, and we'll be right back.